The wheels of the stagecoach thundered over the cracked earth, each jolt rattling Annelise's bones as if the wild Wyoming plains meant to shake her apart. She pressed a trembling hand against the glass, watching as the horizon stretched endlessly into golden dust, a place that looked more like the edge of the world than a home. The letter in her lap, now soft and worn from too much folding, was the only thing tethering her to the promise of a future. To Miss Annelise Rustad, you will have a place on my land, a name to carry, a home to keep. Signed, Caleb Harland, his. Words were short, almost cold, but she had clung to them during the weeks of ocean crossing and endless miles by train and wagon. She had imagined a man with steady hands and steady eyes, a protector who would keep his promise and make this strange land less lonely. The coach lurched to a stop outside the tiny town of Dry Creek, nothing more than a scattering of wooden buildings, under a sky that seemed too big for the earth beneath it. The wind carried grit into her hair and eyes as she stepped down, her boots touching Wyoming soil for the first time. But he wasn't there, the man at the edge of town. She waited. First an hour, then 2, standing stiff under the merciless sun, as townsfolk drifted past, their eyes darting to her stranger's dress and pale Norwegian skin. Finally, an older man in a black hat tipped his brim toward her and muttered, "You're waitin' on Caleb Harland, ain't you?" Her heart leapt. "Yes, do you know where I might find him?" The man scratched at his beard, hesitant. "You'll find him on the edge of the Harland spread about 3 miles north, but—" His voice trailed off. "But, don't take it wrong, miss, but you look an awful lot like someone he buried 5 winters back." The words struck her like a cold gust. By the time she reached the Harland ranch, the sun was sinking low, painting the plains in bruised shades of purple and red. The house was big, solid, built to stand against storms and time, but its windows were dark, as though the place itself was holding its breath. When the door finally opened, a man filled the frame. Tall, broad-shouldered, his shirt sleeves rolled up to weathered forearms. He had the kind of presence that quieted the air around him, but when his eyes met hers, all the strength in his stance faltered. He froze. She saw his hand twitch at his side, his jaw locked tight. "No," he breathed, almost to himself. "Mr. Harland?" she asked softly, her voice nearly lost to the wind. He didn't answer. The ghost in her face inside. The house smelled faintly of cedar smoke and leather, but beneath it was something colder, the emptiness of a place half lived in. Caleb moved, like a man carrying weight too heavy to set down, his silence stretching so long she thought he might tell her to leave. Instead, he poured himself a drink, downed it, and finally spoke. "You shouldn't be here." She stiffened, clutching her letter. "I came because you sent for me. You wrote this." She set the crumpled paper on the table between them like a challenge. His eyes flicked to it, but he didn't reach for it. "I didn't write that." Her breath caught. He raked a hand through his dark, unkempt hair, frustration flashing in his eyes. "Someone's made a mistake, or a cruel joke. My passage was paid," she whispered. "I crossed an ocean. I left everything behind." He looked at her then, really looked, and she saw it in his face, recognition mixed with pain so sharp it nearly undid her. "You have her face," he said hoarsely. "Whose?" "My wife. The one they buried out back. Secrets in the soil." The night wind howled across the plains, rattling the shutters as Annelise sat alone in the guest room, staring at the single candle burning low. She hadn't come this far to turn back. She couldn't. But Caleb Harland was a man of walls and silence, and the town whispered that his first wife hadn't died easy. She rose and moved to the window, her eyes tracing the moonlit rise beyond, the barn where a small wooden cross leaned against the prairie grass. She imagined the woman beneath it, imagined her hands, her hair, her smile, and wondered why fate had led her here wearing her face. Downstairs, Caleb sat at the table, fingers tightening around the glass in his hand. He could still hear the way Annelise's voice trembled when she said his name. He didn't believe in ghosts. But when she touched his hand earlier, it had felt like one reaching through the veil. The promise of storms. The next morning, Annelise rose early, determined to prove she belonged. If not in Caleb's heart, then at least on his land. She fed the hens, drew water from the pump, even tried her hand at mending a fence. The ranch hands watched her with guarded eyes, whispering. When they thought she couldn't hear Dot by noon, a storm rolled in fast from the west, black clouds swallowing the sky, wind clawing at the earth. Caleb found her struggling with a gate and grabbed her wrist, pulling her inside just as the first sheets of rain slammed down. "You'll drown out there," he growled, but his voice carried something beneath the anger. Fear. They stood too, close in the dim light of the barn, rain hammering the roof like hooves on hard ground. She felt his breath, the heat of his hand still on her arm. "Why does it feel like you know me?" she asked, the words spilling before she could stop them. He stepped back as if burned, shaking his head. "Because maybe I did," he said softly. The storm had cleared by dawn, leaving the plains slick and glistening under a pale sun. Puddles mirrored the endless sky, and the scent of wet earth clung to every breath. Annelise rose from her narrow bed, her body weary from a restless night. Her mind circled endlessly around the stranger's words on the porch. "We need to talk about your dead wife." She descended the stairs to find the ranch hushed as though the storm still lingered in its bones. Caleb sat at the table, a half-empty mug of black coffee before him. He did not look at her when she entered. His jaw was tight, his shoulders rigid, and though his hands rested flat on the table, she could sense the restless tension in him, like a wild horse ready to bolt. "There are things you don't understand," he muttered without greeting. Annelise paused in the doorway, her fingers grazing the worn wood of the frame. "Then help me understand," she said softly. "I came here on faith. I came because I believed your letter. If you didn't send it, then who did?" Caleb finally raised his eyes to hers, and she wished he hadn't. Grief lived there, heavy and unrelenting, but also fear, not of her, but of what she represented. "Ghosts have a way of reaching through men's lives," he said, his voice low. "And some debts don't stay buried." The whispers in Dry Creek later that day. Caleb hitched the wagon to ride into town, and Annelise, despite his reluctance, insisted on going with him. She wanted to see more than the inside of his lonely house. She wanted to understand the land she had traded her old life for. Dry Creek was buzzing after the storm. Wagons rolled through mud-slick streets, shopkeepers swept water from their stoops, and children chased each other through puddles. Yet when Annelise stepped down from the wagon, conversations faltered and eyes followed her with sharp curiosity. At the mercantile, women glanced over their shoulders, whispering. A ranch hand outside the saloon tipped his hat, but the look in his eyes was not respect, and it was pity. She heard it then, half hissed by a passing voice. "Looks just like her. God rest the poor woman's soul." Annelise turned, searching for the speaker, but no one met her eyes. When Caleb rejoined her with supplies, his jaw was tight, his silence iron. She wanted to demand answers, but something in the way he carried himself, shoulders hunched, eyes shadowed, told her he was already drowning in questions of his own. Learning the land, the days stretched long on the ranch. Annelise threw herself into work, determined to prove her worth, and perhaps to distract herself from the unease curling in her chest. She learned to milk the cows, though her hands fumbled and the animals shifted impatiently. She gathered eggs, chopped kindling until her arms ached, and walked the fence lines, watching how the endless prairie seemed to swallow everything into its silence. The ranch hands were polite but distant. They answered her questions with curt nods, offered help only when necessity forced them to. She was an outsider in their world, and more than once she caught the wary look of men who thought she might be bad luck, a ghostly double of the woman, buried in the earth behind the barn. Still, there were moments when the land itself seemed to accept her. One afternoon, she stood in the tall grass, the wind brushing against her skin like a gentle hand, the horizon rolling away in golden waves. She closed her eyes, breathed deep, and for the first time since leaving Norway felt something close to peace, until Caleb's voice cut across the prairie. "Don't wander too far. Storms aren't the only danger out here." She turned to him, and for the briefest moment she thought she saw concern in his eyes. Not duty, not suspicion, but something warmer. Something he tried to bury beneath his hard exterior. The river crossing the test came sooner than she expected. One morning, Caleb drove her into the lower pasture, where the herd had scattered, across the far side of a river swollen from recent rains. The only way across was a rough ford where the water rushed swift and brown. "Stay here," Caleb ordered, swinging down from the wagon. But Annelise, determined to prove she was not fragile, followed. "I can help," she insisted, her skirts already soaked at the hem as she stepped into the water. The current caught her by surprise, tugging hard at her legs, dragging the ground from beneath her. Before she could cry out, Caleb's arm shot around her waist, hauling her against him. "Are you mad?" he barked, his voice rough with something between anger and fear. "I won't be useless," she gasped, clinging to him. For a heartbeat. They stood chest to chest, the roar of the river surrounding them. She felt the strength in his grip, the heat of his body against hers, and beneath it all, the ache of something neither of them dared name. He pulled her to safety, his breath harsh in her ear. "You'll get yourself killed trying to prove something that doesn't need proving." Her heart pounded, but she met his eyes. "Then let me live, Caleb. Let me live here. Let me belong." His gaze lingered, softening for the first time, but only for a moment. He turned away, and the wall between them rose again. Moors in the wind. That night, back in Dry Creek, whispers grew louder. Annelise heard them when she stepped into the general store, when she passed the saloon, when the preacher's wife brushed past her on the church steps. It was murder, they say. No proof, but blood leaves stains. And now she's here, like the dead woman come back. Annelise carried those words back to the ranch, her chest tight, her mind racing. Who had Caleb's wife been? And why did her shadow hang so heavy over everything? Later, as she walked past the barn, she paused by the grave once more. The wooden cross leaned at an angle, weather-worn and unmarked except for a single carved initial. M. She knelt in the grass, fingers tracing the grooves. The wind whispered through the prairie, carrying the faintest echo of voices, of secrets buried but not silenced. And somewhere in the darkness of the house behind her, Caleb watched from the window, his face unreadable, his heart a battlefield of grief, guilt, and the dangerous spark of something new. A stranger in the grass. The sun hung low over the prairie, painting the fields in molten gold. When Annelise first saw him, at first she thought it was an animal, a dark shape crumpled against the tall grass at the edge of the lower pasture. But as she drew closer, carrying a basket of eggs from the henhouse, she saw the ragged boots, the blood-dark stain across his shirt, and the unmistakable outline of a revolver at his side. He was young, maybe not much older than Caleb's ranch hands, with copper skin and braids streaked with dust. His breathing came in shallow, labored bursts, and the angle of his arm suggested it had been broken. She froze, torn between fear and compassion. This was Lakota land not so long ago, before the treaties and the fences and the cattle drives. She had heard whispers in town of raids and skirmishes, of bounty hunters and retaliation. Then his eyelids fluttered, and his cracked lips moved. "Water," he rasped, his voice no louder than the rustling grass. For a moment, she hesitated. She thought of the rumors in Dry Creek, the bounty hunter on Caleb's porch, the buried wife whose name she still didn't know. And then she knelt, unstoppered her canteen, and pressed it to the stranger's mouth. He drank greedily, coughing, then met her gaze with dark, fevered eyes. "Don't let them find me," he whispered. Caleb's wrath be the time Caleb returned from checking fence lines. Annelise had dragged the wounded man into the shadow of the barn, laying him on a bed of straw. She had cleaned his wounds as best she could with warm water and a scrap of linen, her hands trembling but steady. "Annelise!" Caleb's voice cracked like a whip, sharp enough to make her flinch. He strode into the barn, his broad frame filling the doorway, his eyes blazing. "What in God's name have you done?" "He was dying," she shot back, rising to face him. "I couldn't just leave him out there." "That's a Lakota," Caleb growled, his hand hovering near the revolver. at his hip. You don't know if he's alone. You don't know if there are more waiting to cut our throats in the dark. She stood her ground, her voice low but fierce. I know he's human, and I know he's bleeding. Their eyes locked, tension crackling between them like dry grass ready to catch flame. For a moment, Caleb looked ready to drag the stranger outside and leave him to fate. Then he exhaled, long and ragged, and turned away. God help us both, he muttered. If the bounty hunters don't kill him, the army will. A story carved in blood throughout the night. Annelise tended to the wounded man, while Caleb paced like a caged animal, his rifle never far from reach. Finally, as the cicadas sang in the darkness and the barn lantern burned low, the stranger stirred and spoke. His name was Chaitin. He told them he was being hunted, not because of his people, but because he'd killed a white man, a bounty hunter who'd tried to frame him for horse theft and murder. There were others, he warned, men who wouldn't stop until they spilled his blood across the prairie. Then he said something that made Caleb freeze mid-step. The man I killed, Chaitin whispered, his voice ragged. He was hunting your wife. Silence crashed over the barn like a falling tree. Annelise blinked, confusion knotting her stomach. His wife is dead, she said softly, though the words tasted wrong even as she spoke them. Chaitin's gaze shifted to her, sharp despite the fever. Not the one you think, he said. The other one. Caleb's jaw clenched. You don't know what you're talking about. Don't I? Chaitin rasped. I saw her, before they buried her, and I've seen her face again. He looked at Annelise. Secrets from across the ocean later, when Caleb stormed out into the night, leaving her alone with the outlaw. Annelise leaned close, her voice barely a whisper. What did you mean? She asked. When you said you've seen her face again. Chaitin's breath came uneven, his words halting but deliberate. You are not here by accident, he said. Someone sent you. Someone who knew what you carry in your blood. Her heart pounded in her ears. I came because of the letter. He gave a pained, bitter laugh. That letter was bait. She shook her head, refusing to believe it. No, it was from Caleb. It had to be. But Chaitin said nothing more, his strength spent, his eyes closing as fever dragged him back under. A bond forged in shadows when Caleb returned. His face was pale beneath the brim of his hat, his knuckles white where they gripped the rifle stock. For the first time since she'd arrived at the ranch, Annelise saw not just grief in him, but terror. You're going to send him away, aren't you? She asked quietly, nodding toward Chaitin's sleeping form. Caleb's voice was rough when he spoke. If I don't, they'll burn this place to the ground looking for him. And if you do, he'll die, she countered. His eyes met hers, hard and unyielding. You don't understand how things work out here. There's law, and there's justice, and neither's on his side. Then whose side are we on? He stared at her for a long moment, and something passed between them. A silent acknowledgement that neither of them was truly safe anymore, and perhaps neither had been from the start. The night riders. Just before dawn, hoofbeats thundered across the plains. Caleb's hand shot to his rifle as he blew out the lantern and motioned Annelise to stay low. Through the cracks in the barn wall, she saw them. 3 riders silhouetted against the rising sun, rifles strapped to their saddles, bounty posters clenched in gloved fists. One of the men called out, his voice carrying sharp and cold through the morning air. Harland, we know you're in there. Hand over the Lakota, and maybe we let the rest of you keep breathing. Caleb stepped into the open, his rifle steady, his stance unshaken. He's not here, he lied, his voice like iron. Annelise's breath caught as one of the bounty hunters leaned forward in his saddle, his eyes narrowing. Funny thing, the man drawled. I heard you were good at hiding bodies, Harland. Be a shame if we had to add another to the pile. The confession beneath the rising sun. The air in the barn was thick with the scent of gunpowder and damp hay. Outside, the bounty hunters sat astride their restless horses, rifles raised and waiting. Inside, the outlaw Chaitin leaned against the wooden post, his face pale with blood loss but his dark eyes steady, burning with something more dangerous than fear. The weight of knowing too much. Annelise crouched beside him, her breath shallow. Her fingers pressed against his fever-warm shoulder. Caleb stood nearby, rifle braced, his jaw locked so tight she thought he might shatter his teeth. "Speak," Caleb said at last, his voice low, measured, the voice of a man standing on the edge of a cliff. Chayton coughed once, spat crimson, onto the straw and nodded. "You want the truth?" "Fine." His words came slow, deliberate, every syllable heavy. "5 years back your wife Miriam didn't just die in that blizzard like they say. She ran." Annelise blinked, her breath catching. "Ran?" "She ran," Chayton repeated, his gaze cutting toward Caleb. "And someone made sure you never found her." Caleb's grip on the rifle faltered for the first time. "Don't," he said, his voice strained. "Don't you dare spin me stories, boy." But Chayton shook his head. "I saw her. I swear it on the bones of my people. She came through Lakota lands, scared and starving, heading east. And then she vanished. Bounty hunters found her body weeks later. At least that's what they told you." Annelise swallowed hard, trying to breathe past the lump in her throat. "And now?" she whispered. "What does that have to do with me?" Chayton's gaze shifted to her, sharp and unyielding. "Because she looked like you," he said softly, "and maybe she wasn't the first." Shadows over Dry Creek by midday, the bounty hunters had been driven off, not by bullets, but by Caleb's cold steel of will and a promise they didn't believe but weren't ready to test. Still calm, Annelise felt their shadows trailing behind them as they rode into Dry Creek later that week. Caleb needed supplies. She needed answers. But the town was restless. The whispers she'd heard before had grown louder, sharper, slicing through the heat-thick air like knives. "There she is. God help her. She's got the dead woman's face. Ain't natural, ain't right. Even the preacher's wife crossed to the other side of the street when Annelise passed inside the mercantile. The shopkeeper's smile was strained, his hands fidgeting on the counter. "Heard tell," he began cautiously, "that trouble's brewing, Caleb. Them bounty riders been stirring up talk, saying maybe Miriam's death wasn't so clean." Caleb didn't look up from the ledger he was signing. "Folks can talk all they want." The shopkeeper hesitated, glanced at Annelise, then lowered, his voice. "And now this one shows up. Looking like the dead come back, folks get ideas, ugly ones." Caleb slammed the ledger shut so hard the man flinched. "She ain't Miriam," Caleb said flatly, "and anyone says otherwise answers to me." But as they walked back to the wagon, Annelise caught the tremor in his hand where it brushed hers, and it scared her more than the whispers. Ghosts and graves. That night, unable to sleep, Annelise wandered beyond the barn to the little hill where the single wooden cross leaned in the wind. The moon painted the land in silver and shadow, the prairie grass whispering like secrets carried on the night air. She knelt beside the grave, her fingers tracing the carved M. "Miriam," she said softly, letting the name linger on her tongue. For the first time, who had she been? What had she run from? And why had fate, or someone's hand, drawn Annelise into this same tangled web? Behind her, footsteps crunched softly in the grass. She turned to find Caleb standing there, his face half in shadow, his hat in his hands. "You shouldn't be out here alone," he said quietly. "Was she happy?" Annelise asked, her voice trembling despite her effort to steady it. He hesitated, his gaze fixed on the cross. "She was wild," he said at last. "Like the wind across these plains. Couldn't be caught, couldn't be kept. I thought I could give her roots, but..." He trailed off, shaking his head. "Did you love her?" His silence stretched so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then softly, "I tried to." Broken vows, the distance between them shrank like breath on cold glass. The night was quiet, except for the whisper of grass and the thud of her own heart. "Caleb," she whispered, his name catching in her throat. He stepped closer, his hand reaching out before he could stop himself, his fingertips brushing hers, a fleeting touch that burned like fire. "I shouldn't," he said, his voice raw, shaking with restraint. And yet, her whisper was almost a plea. He took her hand fully then, rough palm against her softer one, holding her like a man holding back a storm. "You deserve better than the ghosts that haunt me," he said hoarsely. "Maybe," she breathed, her gaze locking with his. "But I'm already here." He closed his eyes as though the weight of her words was both salvation and sin. The trap springs, morning brought no peace. As the sun climbed over the prairie, a rider galloped into Dry Creek carrying a fresh bounty notice. A crowd gathered near, the sheriff's office murmuring and shifting. The tension thick enough to choke on. Annelise and Caleb arrived just as the sheriff tacked the notice to the post. The name written there froze Annelise's blood. Chayton. Wanted for murder. Dead or alive. But beneath it, scrawled in a bounty hunter's hand, was another warning. "And Harland's got him. The murmurs swelled into accusations. "Knew it," someone spat. "He's hiding killers now." "Just like last time." The sheriff raised his hands, trying to calm the crowd. But their anger had found fuel and whispers became shouts. Caleb stood stiff and silent beside her, his fists clenched. Annelise could feel the heat radiating off him, the storm building beneath his skin. "We should go," she whispered. But before they could leave, a voice rose above the din, cold, sharp, and heavy with promise. "You can't run forever, Harland," it said. She turned, and there on the boardwalk stood the same bounty hunter who had knocked on their door the night of the storm, a cruel smile curving his lips. "This time," he said, "we settle it." A sky heavy with warnings. The first snow came early that year. By dawn, the horizon was hidden beneath a curtain of white, the wind carrying sharp flakes that stung the skin and whispered promises of worse to come. Annelise stood at the kitchen window, hands wrapped around a chipped mug of coffee, watching as the prairie transformed beneath the gray rolling clouds. The storm was building fast, sweeping down from the Tetons like a living thing, wild and untamed. Behind her, the creak of boots on old floorboards made her glance over her shoulder. Caleb stood there silent, his shirt sleeves rolled to his elbows, his expression grim. "They'll come today," he said without preamble. "The bounty hunters?" she asked, though she already knew. He nodded once, the motion sharp. "Storm, like this, they'll want him before it swallows the land." Him meant Chayton, who lay feverish in the loft above the barn, still healing from wounds that hadn't had time to knit themselves shut. Annelise set her mug down carefully, willing, her hands not to shake. "We could send him away now," she said softly, "before they arrive. Maybe he'd have a chance." Caleb's jaw tightened. "No, the storm will kill him faster than any bullet." She opened her mouth to argue but stopped when she saw the look in his eyes, that quiet, unrelenting steel. She'd seen it before, on the day she arrived, when he looked at her like she was a ghost. And again when he'd faced down the bounty riders with nothing but his rifle and a voice that brooked no refusal. Caleb Harland was a man who didn't bend. But even steel can break. The silence before the snowy midday. The world was muffled beneath a blanket of white. The wind howled low and constant, carrying with it the promise of being trapped, cut off, buried. The ranch hands had been sent to higher ground with the cattle, leaving only Annelise, Caleb, and the wounded outlaw to weather what was coming. Inside the house, the air was thick with quiet tension. Annelise tried to busy herself by stoking the fire, mending shirts and checking on Chayton, but every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the shutters in the rising wind set her nerves. On edge. Caleb paced like a restless animal, glancing out the window every few minutes as though expecting riders to materialize from the swirling white dot. When she couldn't bear the silence any longer, Annelise spoke. "Caleb, what if they don't want just Chayton?" He turned, his gaze cutting to hers. "What do you mean?" "The whispers in town," she said quietly, her voice barely audible above the wind. "About your wife. About me." She hesitated, swallowing hard. "What if they came here for you?" Caleb's expression darkened, but he didn't answer. And that, more than anything, told her she might be right. A fragile confession night fell early. the blizzard closing in around them until the windows rattled and the roof groaned beneath the weight of the snow. In the flickering firelight, Annelise sat near the hearth, sewing by hand while Caleb oiled his rifle at the table. The silence between them was no longer tense but heavy, full of unsaid words neither dared to release. Finally, she set her needle aside and spoke, her voice quiet, almost hesitant. Chayton said Miriam ran. She said softly. He said someone wanted her gone. Caleb's hand stilled, the rag in his grip falling slack. I don't know what happened to her, he said after a long moment. I woke one morning to an empty bed, tracks in the snow, and the world telling me she died. He paused, his gaze fixed on the flames. But no one ever found her body. Just a story, just a grave they told me to dig. And you believed them? He exhaled slowly, the sound rough, ragged. I had to. Her throat tightened, but she pushed the words out anyway. You loved her. He finally looked at her then, his eyes shadowed and unreadable. I tried to, he said, just as he had by the grave weeks ago. But she was like the wind, wild, untethered, and I was foolish enough to think a ring could hold her. Annelise swallowed hard, her chest aching, but before she could speak, he leaned forward, his voice low, urgent. You're not her, Annelise. You're not her ghost. Then why? She whispered. Do you look at me like you're afraid I'll vanish too? He didn't answer, but in the silence his hand brushed hers, a fleeting touch, hesitant and desperate all at once. And in that brief, fragile moment, the walls between them cracked. The first shot, it came just after midnight. The howl of the blizzard masked the sound until the glass shattered in the kitchen window, and a single bullet lodged deep in the mantel above the hearth. Annelise screamed before she could stop herself, ducking instinctively as Caleb grabbed her and pulled her to the floor. They're here, he hissed, shoving a rifle into her shaking hands. Stay low. Stay quiet. Another shot rang out, splintering the wooden frame of the door. Snow swept in through the cracks, cold and biting as shadows moved against the pale curtain of white outside. Then came a voice, harsh and familiar, carried by the storm. Harland, hand over the Lakota and the girl, and maybe we let you live. Girl.it took her a moment to realize they meant her. Blood on white. Caleb shoved her toward the narrow stairwell. Go, he ordered, his voice sharp, commanding. No, she whispered, gripping the rifle tighter. I'm not leaving you. His gaze cut to hers, fierce and unrelenting, but there was something else beneath it too. Something raw, unspoken, dangerous. Do as I say, Annelise. Before she could answer, the front door burst open, snow and wind and shadows spilling into the house. 3 men stormed in, rifles drawn, their faces hidden beneath scarves and wide-brimmed hats. Everything happened at once. Caleb fired first, the roar of the rifle deafening in the small space. 1 man dropped. The second lunged toward the stairwell, and without thinking, Annelise raised her weapon, her hands shaking as she squeezed the trigger. The blast threw her backward, the sound ringing in her ears, but when she opened her eyes, the man lay crumpled on the floorboards, his breath gone. Her stomach lurched, bile rising in her throat. She had never killed before. The edge of something irreversible, after what felt like hours, but could have been minutes. The last rider fled, into the white, leaving 2 bodies cooling in the snow outside. The wind screamed louder, as though the storm itself bore witness to what they'd done. Caleb stood by the shattered doorway, chest heaving, rifle still in hand. His shirt was torn at the shoulder, blood staining the fabric, but his eyes, when they met hers, were steady, unflinching. You saved me, he said simply. She shook her head, tears burning her cheeks. I killed him. You lived, he corrected, stepping closer. That's what you did. Her breath hitched as he reached out, his rough hand cupping her jaw, his thumb brushing away the cold tears. And there, with the storm raging around, them and blood staining the snow outside, their restraint finally broke. His lips met hers, fierce and desperate, the kiss tasting of salt and gunpowder and everything they'd denied themselves for too long. The calm that wasn't the blizzard had passed, but its silence lingered like a warning. The land stretched out beneath a sky of pale steel, blanketed in white so pure it looked untouched, as though blood hadn't been spilled upon it just hours before. Annelise stood at the window, hands pressed to the cold glass, watching the prairie breathe beneath its shroud of snow. The bodies of the bounty hunters lay beneath hastily marked mounds behind the barn, their graves shallow and frozen. But death never stayed buried long out here. Behind her, the house was quiet, save for the creak of settling wood and the muffled coughs of Chayton in the loft. Caleb had been outside since before dawn, working alone, mending what the storm and the gunfight had broken. Annelise didn't need to see his face to know what haunted him. She felt it too. The weight of what they'd done, what they'd survived. The storm had forced them together, had stripped away the polite distance they'd clung to. She still felt the ghost of his lips on hers, the heat of his hands, the way his breath had tangled with her own in the dark. But now, daylight had come. And with it, reality. The rider in black. The sound of hooves cracked the silence just after noon. Annelise stiffened, heart pounding as she stepped out onto the porch, pulling her shawl tight against the cold. From the rise beyond the pasture, a single rider emerged, a dark figure cutting across the endless sweep of white. He didn't come fast, like the bounty hunters had. He came steady, measured, like a man with time, or one who wanted them to believe he did. Caleb appeared beside her, rifle in hand, his expression unreadable. "Stay inside," he said, his voice low but sharp. She hesitated, searching his face, but there was no room for argument there. The rider dismounted without a word when he reached the gate, the snow crunching beneath his boots as he walked forward. He was tall and lean, his coat black as midnight, his hat pulled low. When he looked up, Annelise caught the glint of pale eyes beneath the brim, eyes like frozen rivers. "You Caleb Harland?" the man drawled, his voice rough as gravel. Caleb didn't move. "Who's asking?" The stranger pulled a folded paper from his coat and held it up between two gloved fingers. "Marshal Ellis. Got a warrant, says you're hiding a fugitive and obstructing justice." Truth in the firelight. That night the marshal stayed. He sat up at their table like he belonged there, sipping coffee while his pale eyes flicked from Caleb to Annelise to the shadows above where Chayton lay hidden in the loft. "There's more to this than horse theft," he said casually, like a man testing a trap to see where it might give. "The men chasing your Lakota friend ain't bounty hunters. They're cleaners." Annelise frowned. "Cleaners?" "Hired guns," the marshal explained. "Paid to bury mistakes so deep nobody ever digs them up." Caleb's jaw flexed, his knuckles white around his mug. "What mistakes?" Ellis leaned back in his chair, letting the silence stretch. 5 years ago, he said finally, a woman named Miriam Harland disappeared. Some say she froze in a blizzard. Some say she ran. But me? His pale gaze fixed on Caleb. "I think she knew something. Something someone wanted buried." Annelise's throat tightened. She tried to speak, but no words came. The marshal turned his attention to her then, his expression unreadable. "And now you show up," he said softly, with her face. A letter in the ashes later. When the marshal retired to the barn, Annelise found Caleb standing by the hearth, staring into the flames as though he could wrestle answers from the fire itself. "Tell me," she whispered. He shook his head slowly, his voice hoarse. "I don't know. God help me, I don't know." Then he pulled something from his pocket, a small battered envelope, its edges singed as though it had narrowly escaped the fire. "I found this in Miriam's trunk," he said quietly. "After you came." Annelise unfolded the paper with trembling fingers. The handwriting was elegant, deliberate, the words sharp enough to cut. "If you love her, keep her safe. If you value her life, send her far from here. They'll use her blood against you." There was no name, no explanation, only a single initial at the bottom. M.A. Choice in the snow just before dawn. The bounty hunters came again. This time, there were 6 of them. Caleb and the marshal took positions near the porch, rifles ready. Annelise crouched inside by the window, her hands gripping the stock of a shotgun so tightly her knuckles ached. Chayton, pale and unsteady, limped to stand beside her despite his wounds. The lead rider called out, his voice sharp and cold against the morning air. Hand over the Lakota and the girl. Last chance. Caleb stepped into the open, rifle raised. You want them? He said evenly. You'll have to ride through me. There was no warning. The first shot cracked, and chaos erupted. Snow exploded beneath galloping hooves. Bullets tore through the frosted air. Annelise fired until her shoulders burned, the sound of each blast ringing through her bones. When it was over, the silence returned, broken only by the whimpering of a wounded horse and the harsh breaths of the living. 2 bounty hunters fled into the distance. 4 didn't. Home at the edge of nowhere as the sun climbed over the battered ranch, its light-touched faces lined with exhaustion and resolve. Marshal Ellis saddled his horse, tipping his hat to Caleb. Whoever's paying these men, he said quietly, they won't stop. You need to be ready. Caleb nodded, his gaze drifting toward Annelise, who stood by the fence, her shawl drawn tight against the cold. I am, he said. Later, When the marshal rode out and the ranch lay quiet again, Caleb found her standing, at the edge of the prairie, staring at the endless white. This place, she whispered. It's nowhere. He stepped behind her, his hand brushing hers. Then nowhere's home, he said softly. She turned to look at him, her heart pounding, and saw not just the man haunted by ghosts, but the one who had chosen to stand, to fight, to bleed. For her she reached for his hand and for the first time since she'd stepped off the stagecoach into Dry Creek, she believed she might belong.